All right, I think we are now broadcasting live from our Mountain Studies Institute Facebook page. I think we're looking pretty good so far. For those of you who are, all right. Please do forgive us for any kind of hang-ups that we have. We are all right. So we're all kind of figuring out how to do this together, and I want to go ahead and open it up. So I want to start off by saying thank you very much to all of you who are joining us tonight for the first of 3 live streaming Forest and Fire Learning Series events here on the Studies Institute Facebook page. I want to say that we hope that everyone is tuning in this evening is staying healthy and safe and happy in this time. And since this is the first Facebook Live event that we are hosting, we just want to say thank you very much, as I said before, for your patience as we learn how to best bring this presentation and this event to you all at home, and also figure out how to simultaneously interact with all of you, as this is meant to be a community event. So please remember, here at MSI and for our speakers, we are all scientists, not social media gurus. So we do appreciate your patience as we navigate moving forward with our work in these platforms and these very interesting times. So I want to go ahead and give a quick background to the learning series, to the Forest and Fire Learning Series. Mountain Studies Institute here in Durango, Colorado, along with local partners, started the Forest and Fire Learning Series in 2018 in order to launch and establish an annual conversation about the state of our forests and how we as a community can address challenges facing our community, the forests in which we live, and our natural resources. So at a time like this, it's important to remember that ecosystems continue to operate without regard to our current crisis, and that we still have to be aware of what's happening in the environments in which we live, which in Southwest Colorado in the last several years has meant wide fluctuations in precipitation and snowpack and shifts in spring and summer temperatures. So this Forest and Fire Learning Series is meant to be an ongoing conversation between the public and city and emergency planners, academics, and land managers about how to build resilience in our community and beyond. So I do want to take a moment to give a very big thank you to all of our sponsors of the Forest and Fire Learning Series. We were very fortunate to have a number of local sponsors to thank for making this event possible. And those sponsors include Wildfire Adaptive Partnership, San Juan Citizens Alliance, the Southern Rocky Mountain Fire Science Network, the Colorado State Forest Service, Maria's Bookstore here in town in Durango, Durango Outdoor Exchange, Garden Sports Outdoors, Four Corners River Sports, Ska Brewing, the Powerhouse Science Center, which is where we would have hosted tonight's event if possible. We also want to thank the San Juan Headwaters Forest Health Partnership, the 232 Cohesive Strategy Partnership, and the Dolores Watershed Resilient Forest Collaborative. And we want to give a very special thanks to Garden Sports Outdoors here in Durango, Colorado, for donating the item, which will be given away as a part of tonight's free giveaway. This is a Mountainsmith Tour Pack valued at $90. You can find out more information in the event posted from our Facebook page. And if you wish to enter into this free giveaway drawing, there are a few stipulations. So first, you must be 18 years of age or older. We would like you must like or follow Mountain Studies Institute on their Facebook page by the end of tonight's learning series, or already like or follow MSI on Facebook. And you must fill out the monkey survey that is going to be pinned to the top of the comment section of this broadcast. So at the end of this, we are going to contact a randomly selected winner via Facebook Messenger the day after the event. So that means tomorrow, April 2nd. And then we will allow you 5 business days to respond in order to collect your prize and to provide an address to which we can send this to you in the mail, which means April 9th. So if you haven't responded by April 9th, we're going to then randomly select a new winner. And whether or not you would like to win this awesome prize, this Mountain Smith Tour Pack, we do ask that you please take no more than 2 minutes to fill out the survey that we have pinned to the top of the comments section of this event. This really helps us understand how to make these events better, how to include more relevant information, and how to move forward with this event and improve upon it year after year. So tonight, a brief outline for the evening is that we are going to have 2 sets of presenters. The first speaker will present for about 30 minutes, at which time we're going to open it up for about 10 to 15 minutes for Q&A. And if you have a question, feel free to go ahead and write it in the comments section. My colleague Dana Hayward is going to be on Facebook addressing and relaying questions so that we can try to make this as seamless as possible. And then after that, we're going to move on to 2 other presentations, each about 15 minutes long. And these 2 presentations build off of each other. So we're going to move from one presentation right into the other. And they're both going to be about 30 minutes. And at which time we're going to open up the rest of the evening until 8 o'clock to questions and answers from our speakers. So as I said, me and my colleague Dana Howard are working together to try and make this a really seamless event, and so that you can be really involved and interactive with this as well. And so she's going to be on Facebook addressing some of the questions that you're going to be asking our speakers. And I think, yeah, Dana, do you want to say hello to our audience this evening?
Hi, everybody. I'm Dana. I will be taking care of your questions and comments to the very best of my ability.
Well, so she's going to be on Facebook. Okay. Whoop. All right. A little trip up there. Still trying to figure out this platform, so thank you again for your patience. Okay, so without further ado, I believe now we are going to go ahead and kick off this year's learning series with our first speaker, Dr. Michael Remke. So Dr. Michael Remke works as a forest research associate at Mountain and arrived at MSI after completing his PhD in forest science at Northern Arizona University in Flagstaff, Arizona in 2019. Prior to his work at NAU, he earned a Bachelor of Science in Environmental Biology at Fort Lewis College here in Durango, Colorado. And Michael's current research focuses on understanding post-fire vegetation recovery and how to foster communities that promote social, economic, and ecological resilience with our surrounding forests. So I'll go ahead and hand it off to you, Mike.
Awesome, thanks, Emily, and thanks everyone for joining us on Facebook Live for these presentations. It's awesome to see people showing up in the digital world to participate, to listen, and to be engaged in these very important conversations. And as Emily alluded to, the ecosystems we live in don't stop simply because we have a pandemic on our hands. So it's great that we're all still carrying forward these conversations. I have kind of been tasked with covering a lot of introducing fire ecology in our forests, as well as some of our community dynamics with forests. So I will do my best to not go over the time given to me, but go ahead and get started. So first of all, cool. So starting off with just some overarching concerns in forests, something I really have been spending a lot of time thinking about is declining U.S. oil production as a result of COVID-19. And well, what does this have to do with forests? Well, a serious decline in rock and roll quality, right? We need rock and roll to do important things in forest, and I'll get to that in a second. But first, I want to show this very clear graph that shows over time oil production on the y-axis on the left-hand side, and the red bars there, and then blue line is showing us crude oil. The red bars are songs from the Rolling Stones all-time greatest songs record, and then the blue line is crude oil production. And clearly, when we have tons of oil production, we have tons of great rock and roll. Well, what does this have to do with anything related to forests? Rock and roll is absolutely critical to productive forest work. I can tell you that in this photo right here, that man was definitely listening to rock and roll as he was dragging his torch around. So, okay, I'm just kidding. This is totally an April Fool's joke. I never listen to rock and roll in the woods, and oil production and rock and roll have absolutely no causal relationship. This was just a funny graph that I happened to find. But for real, getting into the real meat of what I'm going to be talking about today is just a brief introduction to fire ecology, followed by what it means to live with fire and what it means to be a community that's resilient to fire. So to start the overview of the ecology of forests and fire, I want to just highlight all of the different forest types that we generally interact with on the San Juan National Forest and in Southwest Colorado and across the Southwest, really. And starting at our lowest elevation forest, we can look at Piñon-Juniper, move upslope to think about Ponderosa Pine. Further upslope, we have what scientists often classify as xeric or warm, dry mixed conifer. And that further upslope transitions into Mesic or cool, moist mixed conifer. Then we have our beautiful Aspen zone. And at the top of the elevation gradient, we have Spruce-Fir forests. And I'm going to come back to each of these forest types to give an overview for each of them, but just to kind of set the stage of low elevation all the way to our high elevation and what these different forest types look like. So when we think about where these forests lie across space, Emily, who just introduced this learning series, made this great map showing us where all of our forest types are, and again, just generally seeing those Piñon-Juniper at the lower elevations creeping all the way upslope into the mountains, and then Spruce-Fir dominating the high elevations, and of course, alpine above that. So we can easily think about where these forests are across space. And we can also think about how frequently fire comes to these forests across space. So this map is showing the average number of years between fires. On the low elevation, that Ponderosa Pine zone, we're looking at fires that are occurring really like every 7 to 30 years or so. And as we move upslope, we're looking closer to every 50 years in that mixed conifer zone. And then really as we creep into the Spruce-Fir zone, we're moving into that fires occurring every 100 years or so. And we know this type of information because of, we can look at slices from trees and look at these cookies. My camera's doing weird things with this, but we can see where fires actually occur on trees and then use the rings on the trees to date how frequently we see fires. So scientists in the field of dendrochronology have spent a lot of time coming up with the information that's feeding into this. I also am just getting some comments that my audio is really patchy. So 1 second as I kind of troubleshoot that. Sorry, everybody, just 1 sec. Let's see, if I just talk slower, does the audio come through better? All right, 1 sec.
Hi, everyone. Like we said, this is our first go around at this. So thank you for your patience. We're trying to fix the audio so that everyone can hear all the awesome stuff Mike has to say.
Okay, so I just tried calling in. Can people hear me okay right now? Yeah? Okay, cool. So moving forward, let's just dive into some of these different forest types. Sorry about that. Okay, so when we think about our Piñon-Juniper forests, these forests tend to interact with fire. Well, let me back up. So these forests tend to vary in their structure, but often are fairly dense woodlands with strong connected canopies. They're often in geographies with very little ignition sources. So it takes a while for fire to actually happen here. But once fire does happen, these geographies tend to be very windy. And so they lead to very fast moving crown fires. And they tend to only happen in really dry years when there's actually enough kindling source or ignition source to really get the fire started. And so I have on this screen the fire behavior triangle that thinks about weather, topography, and fuels. And I want to introduce that topic a little bit more detailed when we think about Ponderosa Pine. But something else to note that happens a lot in these Piñon-Juniper landscapes is mortality from beetle attack or drought stress, especially in pinyon pines. So in this photo, the junipers are generally alive, and we see all 3 of the pinyon pines in this photo have been killed from beetle attack. So moving upslope into the Ponderosa Pine forests, these are some of our great low elevation forests, and in right places offer these beautiful views into the high mountains. These are forests that are generally open and park-like, sometimes have higher densities depending on sites of north-facing slopes. We have these beautiful gamble oak shrub understories, sometimes grassy understories like in northern Arizona, and sometimes with multiple ages and diverse species. You might find white fir and Douglas fir in the understory of these forests. And so interacting with fire in the Ponderosa Pine system, I want to think about a different triangle, the fire triangle, thinking about how we need fuel, oxygen, and heat to create fire, right? This is something we're all familiar with if we've built a campfire. If you don't have either of these 3 things, your fire goes out. And in this case, heat would be something that's our ignition source. Fuel would be grasses, shrubs, or trees. And oxygen, of course, is just from the wind and air. So let's add heat, an ignition source, say lightning. Heat might start a single tree on fire in Ponderosa Pine. And then we might see on relatively flat slopes that fire behave as a general surface fire, with it just creeping along, burning the grasses and shrubs in the understory. And this is the most common form of fire in Ponderosa Pine, these surface fires that occur every, say, 6 to 30 years. And then, say, and this is a photo of what these surface fires often look like, consuming only the surface fuels, hardly even burning up the trunks of the trees, and just consuming that fine fuel in the bottom of the forest floor. This is what one of these fires looks like following a fire coming through as a surface fire from the 416 fire landscape. But say we change the weather in this fire triangle and add more wind, we might see that fire behavior pick up in intensity and start consuming some of the canopy of some of these adjacent trees and behave a little more intense. Something that looks like this, where it's actually moving up the trunk of the tree and burning some of the green needles that exist on that tree. This is a great example where we see those brown needles following a more moderate intensity fire on the landscape. This was in the 416 fire as well. So then, of course, as this fire keeps creeping around, what if it hits an area with more fuels? This could be where some of those white firs and Douglas firs exist in the understory. Then that fire intensity is also likely to pick up and become a much more severe fire than in geographies with less field loads. So this is when we start to see trees torching or even crown fires beginning to happen even in Ponderosa Pine forested systems. And this is a good example where we had some tree torching on the 416 fire because of increased fuel loads. There was some smaller diameter trees that really contributed to this fire picking up in intensity. And of course, lastly, topography. If you add slope steepness to this equation, you end up with fires that can behave in a much more intense way across all of these elements. And of course, more fuel on steep slopes with weather that can contribute to fire spread is all likely to result in more intense fire behavior. Another thing to note with topography is now you can actually end up with fires that start rolling downhill and spotting downslope from the initial ignition source. So if we move into a different forest type, that warm, dry mixed conifer, we start to look at a forest that has more diversity. We see Ponderosa pine and Douglas fir co-dominating as main tree species. We see a much stronger understory component of white fir and a lot of shrub cover. And so this forest type generally has some similar characteristics to those Ponderosa Pine forests, but with more field loads than Ponderosa Pine forests. And as a result, we generally see less frequent fires in this topography because it takes a drier year for all of that fuel to actually be dry enough to burn. And these fires tend to be more of mixed severity, ranging from some of that surface fire, but since there's heavier fuel loads, more likely to become a more intense fire. So we might see individual or multiple trees torch, but we're likely to see many green trees still following a fire in warm, dry, mixed conifer forest. And this is what a warm, dry, mixed conifer forest looks like post-fire on the 416 landscape. Again, many brown needles, but if you look closely at this picture, you'll see that there are some green needles still present on some of those trees. Moving forward into the Mesic mixed conifer, or the cool, wet mixed conifer, now we start to see Ponderosa Pine no longer existing in these systems. We start to see Douglas fir become the dominant tree species, maybe mixed in with white fir, potentially some blue spruce, and maybe even some Engelmann spruce. We see a strong aspen component in these forests, and then we still see this really dense shrub understory. So these forests tend to be really diverse. They often have snags, and they often have very heavy fuel loads. And as the name implies, these forests are generally fairly wet. They receive ample winter snow and plenty of summer rain. And so moisture causes fire to be much more limited in these systems, and we tend to see much more infrequent fire occurring every 50 to 100 years. And these fires tend to also be more intense as a result. If it's actually a dry enough year for these fires to occur, there's a ton of fuel in these systems. So the result tends to be more tree mortality, more high severity fire, some mixed severity, and of course, where these aspen trees exist, we end up seeing strong aspen regeneration and a really strong positive response from the aspen. This is a great example of this more high severity end of a fire in the Mesic mixed conifer and the 416 fire landscape. And so you see most of the needles were entirely consumed, and there are sprouting shrubs and aspens starting to come back in the understory. Aspen, as I just mentioned, has a very strong positive response to these fires. It often occurs in these dense colonies that resprout following fire because it has a strong underground root system that can sucker from or sprout from following a disturbance. And so we generally consider aspen to be an early successional species that's replaced by conifers later on. And just a fun fact, the aspen forest that's so prominent on Colbang Pass and Mullis Pass is a result of the Lime Creek fire that burned in 1879. And these aspen stands responded positively to that fire. So you can see the burn mosaic from that Lime Creek fire still today on the landscape by where the aspen is. And then lastly, moving up the slope into the Spruce-Fir zone, this is a forest type of high elevation. So many of us, if we didn't have shelter-in-place orders, might be spending our weekends skiing in the Spruce-Fir zone. Most of our skiing happens in this high elevation forest because it receives tons of winter snow and also lots of summer rain. So it's a very wet forest type. It's dominated by subalpine fir and Engelmann spruce, and fire is almost always limited by moisture. But when it's dry enough to burn in this forest type every, say, 100 to 700 years, depending on where exactly you are, these forests tend to burn hot in stand replacing fires. But so this was a Spruce-Fir forest in the 416 landscape that burned relatively hot. Once again, there was some aspen mixed in here, so you can see some aspen starting to sprout following that fire. Generally, these are what these forests look like in a post-burn environment. But there's also another phenomenon that's happening in a Spruce-Fir forest, which is high rates of spruce bark beetle activity and mortality. And this is in part from drought stress and in part from warmer springs. So it's a relatively complicated interaction. And often we tend to think, as we look at these forests, like, oh, that is totally primed for fire. It's very dry looking, but And sometimes there's still green trees or regeneration in those forests following these beetle outbreaks. So this is near Pagosa Springs in the 4 Mile Creek drainage. And so you can see widespread mortality in the spruce-fir, but some surviving trees and some regeneration of subalpine fir. And the reality is when these fires happen, even in the beetle kill, it has to be a really dry year. These are constantly moisture abundant systems. So even though it looks like a kindling, it still takes a very strong dry year, and fire behaves almost precisely how it did when all these trees had green needles on them. So this is a really important thing to remember. It has to be a fire year for these fires to happen. And once again, these burn as stand replacing fires. So in general, what we hope to see following large disturbances is a mosaic with patches of low, moderate, high severity, and even unburned fire. And so in this photo from the 416 fire landscape, beyond the beautiful lupins blooming in the foreground, we see this lovely mosaic looking up the drainage, where there's patches of green, patches of areas where the needles have been entirely consumed, patches of aspen that burnt with regeneration happening underneath them, and patches where there's still brown needles left on the trees, really representing all of these different burn severities across these different forest types and across different slopes. So we know these forests have fire with varying level of frequencies, and we know that we live in a geography that's immediately adjacent to these forests. So what does that actually mean to live with fire? Those of us in Southwest Colorado maybe had a too close to home experience with the 416 fire, but miraculously no structures were burned. And perhaps it's not actually a miracle. Perhaps community engagement and being proactive really helped us prevent structure loss in this case. So what are the steps that we can take as a community to be more resilient to and to be ready to live with fire? And just a reminder, with COVID-19, many shelter in place and other orders limiting travel, fire season's just around the corner. We're in April right now, and our fire season starts to ramp up in May, June. So fire season is coming, and that means emergency preparedness is heavy on our shoulders. And I think it's important to reflect on what we can do as individuals, as well as communities, and as broader geographies to be ready for fire season. So starting to think and looking ahead to what we might be able to expect for summer of 2020, right now, it's been pretty dry, especially in our lower elevations. And we have lots of fuel accumulated from our very wet 2019 year. So this graph is looking at snow water equivalent across space. The deeper the pink, or the brighter the pink, the more snow there is. The blue is a little bit of snow, and where there are no colors other than the natural topography underneath of the browns and greens, that's implying that there is no snow on the ground and therefore no snow water equivalent. So the areas that are brown are places that currently are primed for fires once we have ignition sources like lightning or people camping out in the woods, given that we continue on this drying pattern. Just a reminder to the fire behavior triangle I alluded to earlier, topography, fuels, and weather all matter. So whether or not we have a wet or dry April and May really determines what happens come our peak fire season in May and June. There's still a little too early to actually know. But what I really want to point out is our high elevations, that spruce-fir zone, still have plenty of snow. I can almost guarantee I'd be skiing if it wasn't for the shelter-in-place order. So this is a good thing to remember. Spruce-fir might not be at high risk for fire right now, but our low elevations could be. And something to think about for how we as communities respond to and interact to fires or smoke in the air. One of the collaboratives that Mountain Studies works with, the San Juan Headwaters Forest Health Partnership, worked together to build this smoke resource. So you can go to sanjuanheadwaters.org/smoke and see a live iteration of this map that auto updates. The triangles on this map represent air quality indexes, and you can turn on and off more layers in the map once you're interacting with it on the web page. And then the flames represent fire detects from satellites, and then the gray represents smoke plumes. And what is really cool about this is you can actually see active fires and smoke and how it's influencing your geography. So this is a live image from just a few days ago, and perhaps you're aware, perhaps you are not, but the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico and other geographies across the Caribbean side of the world are experiencing pretty widespread fires in the dry tropical forests. So all of those smoke plumes are coming straight from Mexico, and when this image was taken, they were tracking into Texas. So this is a great resource that communities can use to keep track of what's happening in their surrounding geography. Okay, now to the less fun stuff, burning down the house. And I'm not talking about a Talking Heads song, though perhaps I should be, given the joke I started this with. Of course, when we think about communities, we're really thinking about us living in the forests. We live here because we value the forests. And something that I think is pretty important to keep in mind is the first thing that we can do to protect our homes as individuals is thinking about removing fuels from that fire triangle. We can't control the weather, and we can only subtly manipulate topography. So removing fuels is our best bet. Specifically thinking about structural improvements, metal roofing, screens behind and beneath roof vents, and as well as having no exposed flammables on the outside of your house are the immediate first steps, because often with these fires, we see ash falling on top of houses, causing the house to start on fire, rather than direct contact from flames. So the best thing you can do to protect your structure is these initial steps. Beyond that, you can start thinking about structural defensible space, where you actually remove vegetation. So say from 15 feet in front of your house, you remove all of the fuels, but maybe further out, 30 to 50 feet from your home, you start thinning out trees and shrubs so that there's not continuous fuel for a fire to spread into that immediate zone adjacent to your house. And then if you have a larger part of land away from 50 feet from your house, you might want to actually think about improving the health of the forest and continuing to disconnect some of those fuels. This is of course going to vary how it looks depending on what the current conditions of the forest around your house is and what fuel type you live in. If you live in PJ, Piñon-Juniper versus Ponderosa, you have very different steps to take. Or if you live in Silverton and you are dealing primarily with Spruce-Fir, you have an entirely different suite of tools to protect your house. But generally following these defensible space guidelines is evidence-based tool to help protect your home. And if you have a series of homes in a subdivision, then hopefully what you do starts to connect to what your neighbor does to create a community that has zones that are resilient to fire. And of course, especially as we operate under shelter in space or shelter in place guidelines as fire season approaches, emergency preparedness is going to be really important. Knowing your evacuation routes and where you're going to go prior to a fire spreading into our community is probably the smartest thing each individual homeowner can do as a worst case scenario step. Even with defensible space measures, you might save your house, but you'll still want to leave your house during that incident. And, you know, something to be thinking about is what are the valuables that you need to bring with you when you leave your house, just in case. You know, something to also think about is Wildfire Adaptive Partnership here in town and across our communities. There's a ton of work to help us think about these steps, how you can prepare your home, how you can prepare yourself, and how you can prepare the broader community for fire. And there's even some programs, including in Forest Lakes, to help support homeowners to do this work so you don't have to pay for it all out of pocket. So Wildfire Adaptive Partnership is a great resource. Something I've been spending a lot of time thinking about is how to expand this from the home and the sub-community to the broader community. And something I'm using to think about this is what's called a fire shed. And so the fire shed shown on this map anywhere in black is a geography where a fire could start and then spread into our communities and thus create a fire hazard. And something else to think about where there's a more immediate threat is what I'm calling the community start zone, which is that immediate area around where our communities are and that have high probability or affinity for fires to start. These two things combined create heavy weight for where we might expect to see fires start and where we might expect to see fires spread and threaten our communities. And if we think about, say, just the forests around our communities, Ponderosa Pine as one, the immediate area around our communities, or the start zone, is generally listed in Ponderosa Pine forested ecosystems. So we really need to think about how we can live with fire in Ponderosa Pine ecosystem adjacent to our communities. And something I'm starting to think about with this is, where do we prioritize work to protect our communities? How do we think about what I described for the defensible space around homes to create defensible space around communities? So this is prioritizing mechanical fuels reduction treatments around our communities, where dark green represents the highest priority, bright green represents the next highest priority based on current forest conditions and desired conditions. And this really shows around our communities, we should be working on improving forest health and reducing fuels through mechanical treatments by, say, removing some trees and thinning out the forest to help disconnect some of those fuel loads. Whereas another tool that we have available is prescribed fire. And so now this is showing prioritizing geographies for prescribed fire, again, where greens represent shades of high priority and yellows represent maybe mixed results. So you see immediately adjacent to many of our communities, we end up with general mixed results for prescribed fire. Perhaps it would be a better tool after we implemented those mechanical treatments. But then there's other geographies where we could get a lot of acreage treated simply by putting fire on the landscape. So prescribed fire is another great tool. And both of these tools are strongly evidence-based, as our speakers coming up after me from the Forest Service will help us better understand greater detail for both of these tools. And something else I've been spending some time thinking about is, how can communities empower themselves more? And this is all hypothetical, but perhaps we can think about training local communities on fire preparedness and mitigation. Or we could also think about, or maybe perhaps in addition to that, we could think about having local prescribed fire and fire prep crews, creating local jobs to help improve our fire preparedness resources, whether that's simply cutting line or whether that's actually getting people red card certified so they can put out hose lays and actually provide on the ground work. This could be a great buffer against the fragility of some of our economies given a significant fire event. We know a lot of our restaurants lost money during the 416 fire. So what if we also had restaurant crews who every year received the refresher and were ready to be mobilized in the event of a fire to keep those people employed and also to provide rapid on the ground resources? This is literally just food for thought. There's a lot of logistics to think about with this, but it seems like a good opportunity. And with that, I will happily take questions, and we have quite a few minutes for questions, and I think Dana and Emily are going to moderate questions to me, so you can type them in the comments.
Hey everyone, please do type any questions that you have into the comment section. I'm moderating it, and I will make sure that Mike knows that you are asking a question and can respond to it.
Yeah, so the website for the smoke tracking is, we can also type out the URL in the comment feed, but it's sanjuanheadwaters.org/smoke. Cool. Well, if we don't have any more questions, do we want to move on to Matt? Or how about just another minute for more questions or comments from folks? So Kara asked us if there could be any requirement for metal roofs in fire-prone areas. That's a really great and interesting question. Some communities in California, mostly at the subdivision level, have begun requiring metal roofs. In other cases, insurance companies are requiring, if you live in a fire-prone area, that you demonstrate your house is fire prepared, and they often have checklists that you need to fill out to demonstrate fire preparedness, or they might even send an investigator on their own dime to make sure that you meet their standards. So there are communities that are starting to require that, and I think it's a really interesting idea. Perhaps in the future we'll see more top-down requirements from county level or city level, but right now there's not much of that happening. So great question. And then Ethan asked if we can give an elevation gradient for the different forest types in the Southwest. A lot of why I didn't provide that right away is because they vary a little bit based on available moisture and aspect, whether you're south or north facing. But generally the Piñon-Juniper forest type is from our 5,500 to 6,500 foot range. Ponderosa Pine we see from 6,500 to 7,500 or up to 8. And our warm dry mixed conifer, we're kind of looking at that like 7,500 to 8,500. Cool moist 8,500 to 9 or 92, maybe up to 95. And then Spruce-Fir, looking at that higher elevation, 95 plus up to tree line at about 12,400. But of course at tree line that tend to be pretty stunted and short. And then our Aspen has a pretty wide range. You'll find Aspen all the way down in Ponderosa Pine at the higher elevations of Ponderosa Pine at 7,200 or so, all the way up to close to tree line in some places, especially in northern New Mexico, but generally not quite tree line in many cases. So closer to say 10.5 or 11. And then I just saw a question pop in from Becca asking if there's a plan for prescribed burns in the Durango area before fire season begins. There are a lot of acreage planned for burning. One of our next speakers, Noah, is from the San Juan National Forest, and he'll be able to talk more about that question. And we'll see what his thoughts are, but I know there's lots of acres planned. It all depends on weather conditions allow for prescribed fire. So there are some geographies over around Boggy Draw. I'm imagining they're going to want to burn again over near Dolores. We're likely to see some burns in the Pagosa Springs area, as well as in the Bayfield area again this summer. I'm not sure what else NOAA has planned. There are some important notes from Region 2 and 3 that might be holding off on prescribed fires. Region 2 and 3 is the Rocky Mountain region where Colorado is, and Region 3 down in the Southwest region where New Mexico is because of COVID. So, you know, there's a lot of uncertainty in terms of if we're going to be able to put fire on the ground this coming spring, but that website, sanjuanheadwaters.org/smoke, I am updating that information, including the shape files for the exact geographies where prescribed fires are going to happen and when they're going to happen. So as we get closer to fire season, that website will be updated regularly. So please use that as a resource, and we'll have more information when we actually get there. And I think with that, one more question. Ben Bain was asking, are moisture levels in trees checked on a regular basis, and could that data predict fire season details? There is some level of field moisture information that's collected on a semi-regular basis. And again, NOAA might have a better answer as to how frequently they're collecting that information, but that is some of the information that's going into the models to determine field dryness. And then that's also the information that's determining the fire danger signs you see when you drive past the Forest Service ranger stations, and how they relay fire danger information. So field moisture is a very important check for whether or not we're going to have fire weather behavior or a bad fire season. I think NOAA will probably have more information on that as well, but that is something that we do use on a regular basis to inform us. And then certainly if we're doing prescribed fire, moisture levels in trees and shrubs as well as grasses have to be collected. So we do a great job of tracking that as best as resources allow. And I think with that, we will probably turn it over to Matt, and Emily will introduce him.
Yeah, you got it. All right, great. I just first want to say thank you so much, Mike, for sharing all that background information about forest and fire ecology, and for sharing all the information about smoke from prescribed and wildfires. And a big thank you to all of you at home who asked questions, really great questions. Keep them coming in. And again, thank you. We really appreciate your patience as we figured out the audio situation on our end. So I hope that all of you at home can now hear a little bit or a lot bit more clearly. So we're going to go ahead and transition to Noah Daniels. Noah Daniels is the District Fuels Assistant Fire Management Officer for the Columbine Ranger District based in Bayfield, Colorado. He has worked for the Forest Service for 7 years, the National Park Service for 10 years, and for 8 of those years at the National Park Service, Noah worked on a crew that specialized in implementing prescribed and managed fires. So thank you so much, Noah, for joining us this evening and for sharing your experience and your expertise. So I'll go ahead and hand it off back to you.
Okay, can you hear me all right? Okay, I'm getting a thumbs up. Yeah, I can address a couple of the questions regarding the future fire plans and behavior, and I'll get into that at the end of this presentation along with other questions. So I'm going to kind of talk about the difference between prescribed fire and managed fire here on the Columbine Ranger District and on the San Juan National Forest in general. So what are we trying to do with managing fires and allowing fires to burn on this landscape? One of the biggest ones, as Mike got into, we're trying to reduce the possibility of catastrophic wildfire impacting communities and the ecosystem, because it really isn't beneficial for either of those. We're trying to restore the fire return interval to a more natural state. And as he was mentioning, in areas like the Ponderosa Pine and oak areas, that is way out of whack. We've been suppressing fire there for over 100 years. And as he mentioned, there's a return interval of anywhere from 7 to 30 years. So in that time, we've allowed a lot more fuel to accumulate and increase the chance for catastrophic wildfires. So we're trying to treat a lot of acres, especially in that the Ponderosa Pine oak band, without negatively impacting wildlife habitat, recreational opportunities, water quality. And in fact, what we're trying to do is improve wildlife habitat and other natural features of the forest. We're also trying to work to minimize the limitations that we face these days from legal boundaries. A lot of the forest, especially in areas like the Animas River corridor, is bounded by boundaries that are based on legal straight north and south, east-west lines. And it doesn't really make sense when those lines, to stop burning at those lines when there's beneficial results from burning across those onto private land, onto state land. And we're working with the various groups that were mentioned as sponsors of this talk to make it a little easier to burn across those boundaries. So the two main tools that we work with are prescribed and managed fires, and I'll get into what those entail. Prescribed fire are fires that are lit by forest management people. We're out in the woods with drip torches, we go through a lot of hoops, and then we go out and we light the woods on fire. And one of the pros of that is that we can choose when to start. For this area, we often focus on the fall. There's some spring burning on the Dolores and Pagosa Springs Ranger districts, but we've had better luck in the fall. This year, one of the limitations is going to be the pandemic. And for now, all prescribed fire for the National Forest has been put off indefinitely. At least the spring and early summer is out, and they're still to be determined with fall burns for this year, just because of the increased risk of smoke in the air for this situation, and also firefighters potentially contracting that disease. Since we can choose when to start, that gives us time to prep these units prior to ignitions. So we can go out, we can choose lines carefully in places that make sense for holding the fire. We can spend quite a bit of time and effort to prep those lines, removing fuel, digging fire lines, so that when we do go to burn it, we have a very good chance of keeping it in the area that we want it to be in. And we also have time to build the buy-in of management and the public before we start. That's very important, especially in areas like this where there's subdivisions, where there's towns very close to forest areas. We want the people to understand what we're doing, why we're doing it, when we're doing it, and what the benefits are, and why we're willing to be out taking this risk to burn these landscapes and try and restore them to a more natural setting. Cons for prescribed fire: getting resources may be hard, like meaning fire crews, engines, helicopters, especially in the fall, because a lot of people have been busy all summer, and that time of year, there can be fewer and fewer people available to come out and help burn. And even though we do everything we can to control all the factors that go into it, there's several unpredictable factors, the foremost being weather, that can really come into play. And we are assuming a large amount of risk by undertaking these projects with that unpredictable nature. And I'll get into that a little bit with one of the case studies coming up, how that can play out in real life. And also, prescribed fire has a very long planning process, and the next slide covers that planning process. I'll give you a minute to read all that. Now, that's what it takes, from thinking about doing a project somewhere, going through the entire NEPA planning process, getting clearance from the state to produce smoke, getting a permit for that, and writing a burn plan that will very tightly constrain how, when, and where we're burning before you can finally get to the end and actually go out and light a prescribed fire unit. So please don't try and read any of that, but that's a great illustration of how complicated and time-consuming this process is. From start to finish, optimistically 2 to 3 years. Managed fire is kind of similar, except we start with a natural ignition. And there's a bunch of pros associated with that. Funding comes from a different source, so that continues to keep money available for prescribed fire that we choose to do. Arguably, it is a more natural fire because it is lightning starting the fire on the landscape, and we are doing some things to help manage that rather than just fully suppressing it. And that ties into the flexibility that we have with objectives and tactics. On some portions of it, say areas that are adjacent to private land or subdivisions, we can be very aggressive in suppressing that fire. In other areas, maybe that goes up to the Weminuche Wilderness or other areas, natural breaks, we can be a little more hands-off with our tactics in those situations. Planning is still required for these managed fires, and we're constantly evaluating if they're going successfully or not and what our future plans are, but the process is definitely more streamlined than for prescribed fire. Cons, it can still be a hard sell to some stakeholders and managers. And we have a long history of suppressing fires and really emphasizing the importance of that. So when we're saying that we're going to allow a fire to burn during the heart of fire season, let's say the hottest days of June before the monsoon gets here, and people have memories of recent fires like the 416 fire, that can be a hard sell to locals, that can be a hard sell even to managers in the Forest Service itself. So we really have to make sure that we're doing this objectively, taking in all the evidence, and that we're not talking ourselves into it, but we're also not talking ourselves out of it. We don't have a choice in the location or timing of the start, so we do a lot of pre-planning to kind of strategize what we'll do with fires in certain areas. We have maps with potential spread. Once we do get a start, we run models to see how quickly that fire may grow if it's just left alone with current and predicted weather conditions. It's a potentially long-term event. If we have a fire that gets going in June, we have a weak monsoon, that fire can still be going in October or November very easily. And that can try everyone's patience, both the public and the people working in the Forest Service, and kind of strain our capacity, because often we have other things that we need to be doing as well, not just focusing on one fire. So that comes into play when we're deciding what to do with these fires. What is the potential for them to stretch into weeks or months? So that's just a brief overview of those two different types. A good example of prescribed fire on the Columbine Ranger District has been the Pargin prescribed fire. That's the green block here. It's about 15 miles east of Bayfield along the Highway 160 corridor, and that unit's about 5,000 acres. It was burned in 2016, and then we burned it again last fall. And that photo on the right shows kind of an example of what that fire looked like a few weeks after the ignitions. We had lit this entire area with aerial ignition, but many of those areas had burned a little bit and went out. Others retained some heat, like that continued to burn from mid-September when we lit it until the middle of November, because we didn't really get any precip. So that's something that we were prepared for. It wasn't what we wanted, because the smoke production definitely continued for a lot longer than it normally does with these kinds of fires, but we were able to hold it in the boundaries and call it a success. Here's a couple pictures of before and after, with the before on the left and the after on the right. Kind of on the left, it's kind of that dry mixcon area, and on the top, and on the right, it shows how that burns under these circumstances. Very patchy. It's quite the mosaic. When areas like that burn in that forest type, it really creates the opportunity for new growth to come in. And it also reduces the loading of fuels, so the chance for more extreme fires to get going in that area is really limited. On the bottom, you can see really the only difference is some gamble oak that's green on the left and brown on the right. That's another thing that we're trying to achieve in these areas, is minimal impact on the overstory, not killing any Ponderosa pine, not wiping out large stands of trees, but knocking back the oak a bit to kind of open that up, create some new growth, and improve the habitat for wildlife. A good example of a managed fire was the 842 fire, which was in 2017. That was about 1,000 acres. And that is immediately adjacent to the southeast corner of the Pargin prescribed fire. That was one of the reasons that they felt comfortable starting to manage this, was that the Pargin burn had reduced fuel loading on the entire northwestern portion of the area. So lightning strike, they spent some time and effort putting in line and doing some ignitions, as you can see on the bottom left, very careful ignitions with low fire behavior, low rates of spread, and very low impact to the canopy. And they were able to get that up to about 1,000 acres before the rain came in and pretty much put it out. Now that one's especially significant for the date. That was 2017, late summer. 2018 was one of the drier years in Southwest Colorado, virtually no snowpack. And as many people are aware, that's when the 416 fire got ripping north of Durango. Just a few days after the 416 fire got going, there was a lightning strike in the area of the 842 fire that, if the models proved to be correct, had tremendous potential to spread rapidly with very dry conditions, lots of wind, and potentially even impact Pagosa Springs to the east within a few days. They sent, once they saw that there had been a lightning strike out there, they sent firefighters out to look for it, and they couldn't locate where that was, because the 842 fire had been so successful in reducing the fuel loading in that area that that fire probably got into a tree and went out very quickly because it didn't have anywhere to go. So that's a great success story for managing a fire, of being able to choose the time and place when we do this, not talk ourselves into it, not talk ourselves out of it, but make very evidence-based decisions on fuel loading, on fuel moistures, on predicted weather, time of year, resource availability. It's fairly complicated, but it's worth the effort, because then it gives us good success of getting fire back into the ecosystem with both prescribed and managed fire without causing destructive fire behavior, as may happen if we continue to just go with the old approach of putting everything out until we can't. So just to answer a couple of those questions before we open it up for more questions, yeah, spring burning is out this year because of coronavirus. There may not be burning in the fall even, depending on how long this stretches out, because they really don't want to create smoke that will impact people who may be facing this infection. Regarding fuel moistures, those are sampled all across the West, at least every 2 weeks, and put into a database. And those are done at multiple sites. We use multiple species, and we use over a wide elevation and topography area. So we can get a really good picture with that of what kind of fire conditions we might have if something gets started. And that also comes into our planning for prescribed fire. Okay, that's all I have. If we have any questions, I'd be happy to answer those. Okay, we have a question from Sarah. If we can speak more to how COVID-19 is affecting forest management this season. That is a question that is being answered on a daily basis. It's unfolding and plans are changing, but the Forest Service is trying to put the safety of the public and the safety of its employees at the forefront of any decisions, realizing that, you know, for fire management, for forest management, a few months is not a very long time from the viewpoint of the forest, but a few months of prioritizing the people in this situation will really benefit both the public and the employees. And then Mike wonders can we decide where fires should be? And do we think about where strong control lines exist? Absolutely. Yeah, that's all part of the pre-planning process. And we've established areas that have kind of boundaries already preset. We look at trails, we look at rivers, we look at roads, we look at large stands of aspen. All of those are things that we pre-identify so that when we do get a natural start, we can already start to draw the box before we even go out and look at it, because we have a tremendous amount of local experience, and we're constantly, people ask, what do you guys do in the off season when there's no fire? This is what we do. We try and pre-plan as much as we can and come up with strategies so when we do have a start, we're already ahead of the curve and hopefully on our way to managing it well rather than just being reactive. Okay, if there aren't any other questions, we'll move on, but I'll give anybody just a couple more seconds to get those in. And oh, good question. What about what's the thinking on unplanned ignitions in light of COVID? So our current plan with that is to suppress fires as quickly as we can, as small as we can. Once again, realizing that this is a short-term thing relative to the longer-term management of the forest. If we keep those fires small using local resources, we can prevent the need for large fire camps, extended assignments with potentially hundreds or even thousands of people having to come in and work on these fires that could last for months. So it's not ideal. We're making a lot of compromises, and that's one of them, that we're going to really try to suppress fires as small and as quickly as we can this summer for that safety priority. Okay, cloud seeding is a somewhat controversial method of geoengineering precipitation by creating more condensation nuclei. And I'm not really very familiar with that, but that could be something that we look at if we do get that unpredictable level of precip, because it seems like around here it used to be a lot more predictable. The monsoons were on a schedule. The fall rains and snows were on a schedule. And that seems to be getting a little different in recent years and making it harder for us to plan ahead for that sort of thing. But yeah, there's lots of options out there that we need to research better. David wants to know the current state of moisture levels in the area and our outlook for summer. It's still early, but lower elevations are fairly dry. The snowpack in the mountains is good, but it really, like Mike was saying, the next month or so is really what's going to tell. How quickly does that melt off? How quickly do the lower elevation fuels dry out? And especially in that Ponderosa Pine band, the pine needles on the ground, the soil moisture are kind of critical as far as fire spread goes. So it's dry, and it really is up in the air at this point as far as how that's going to impact fire behavior. Could the technique be used as for managing fire, the cloud seeding used as a tool to manage fire outbreak along with preventative measures? Yeah, if it's shown that it's a reasonably successful technique, it definitely could be something we look into. And Ben wants to know, were the 416 fire lines managed for noxious weeds last year? Yeah, our range folks were up there a ton working on that, because yeah, that can be a real problem with that amount of high fire behavior. The spread of noxious weeds is one of our biggest concerns post-fire, and erosion as well. So we're definitely not turning our back on the 416 fire for quite a while. Okay, it looks like we're getting one more question, and then I'll probably turn it over to Matt Tuten after this one. From comparisons in forests of northern Arizona, restoring springs in the forest affects the amount of moisture in forests. Are there plans to restore springs in the San Juans? That question is from Anastasia. That is an excellent question. I'm not really sure what our planning is on that. That can be more along the lines of a range management project. And I don't know, actually. I've only been here for a year now. Actually, as of today, I've been on the San Juan for 1 year, and there's still a lot I have to learn about what other folks are up to. But yeah, I could totally see that as being something that's worth looking at. Okay. If there's nothing else, I will hand this over. Thank you for your attention and your excellent questions.
All right, I'm going to quickly go ahead and introduce our next speaker. Just want to go ahead and give a quick thank you to Noah for delving into and sharing all of your work. And I want to say a special thank you as well to Sarah, Mike, Claire, David, Ben, and Anastasia for all of your thoughtful questions. We really appreciate it. Keep them coming. And so now we're going to go ahead and introduce our next speaker, Matt Tuten. So Matt Tuten is a district silviculturist and forestry program manager on the San Juan National Forest. Prior to his Forest Service career, he worked for 8 years as a restoration technician at Northern Arizona University's Ecological Restoration Institute, contributing to forest restoration research across the Southwest. About a decade ago, he left the university to become a forester with the U.S. Forest Service in Montrose, Colorado, where he worked to help implement forest restoration projects on the Uncompahgre Plateau. For the last 4.5 years, he has managed the timber and silviculture programs on the Columbine and Ponderosa Ranger Districts. And if you see forestry equipment on the National Forest between the La Plata Mountains and Wolf Creek Pass, Matt and his co-workers probably had something to do with it. So in addition to his Forest Service career, Matt runs a successful side business, forestersonly.com, where foresters can go to find a partner as passionate about forestry as themselves. And Matt, his wife Kelly, and kids Jesse, 2, and Alice, age 4, all live in Pagosa Springs, Colorado. So thank you again so much, Matt, for jumping on here and sharing your experience and your knowledge with us. And go ahead and turn it on over to you.
Oh, you cracked me up. I didn't think you'd read that. I don't actually run forestersonly.com. I'm not sure there's much of a market for that. Hey, thanks for joining me tonight. I appreciate everybody tuning in. I definitely appreciate this discussion. Definitely appreciate focusing on something other than COVID-19 news. Since most of us, Southwest Colorado, are stuck at home, wanted to focus on how we're managing the Ponderosa Pine Forest, where we're all kind of located right now, and focus a little bit more on how we're using scientific evidence to guide how we manage these forests. I think most of us are aware we use science to guide management, but I want to dig a little bit deeper into how science is used to inform the practice out on the ground. Since I manage the harvest program on the forest, I'm going to talk mostly about harvests and how science informs the harvesting program, but this type of science informs the burning program that Noah just talked about. We use harvest to manage the mature trees, usually trees that would be hard to manage with fire or dangerous to manage with fire. And I'll also cover what happens to the material that we produce when we complete these harvests. So with that, I want to dig into what evidence-based forestry really is, or evidence-based forest management. It's really this conscientious application of science to get certain outcomes on the ground. And a really good model for understanding evidence-based forest management is evidence-based medicine. to go there for just a second. Doctors, medical practitioners, they use peer-reviewed research, clinical studies, they use research notes, they use tests on you, they use measurements, all kinds of data as part of evidence-based medicine. But evidence-based medicine also includes your patient values or the patient values and their preferences. You have a say in what happens in your treatment. They also apply their own judgment, their clinical expertise in what happens. And you combine all that stuff and you get something that's more or less referred to as evidence-based medicine today. Now, evidence-based forest management is a little different. I mean, we have a whole body of research relating to forest management, peer-reviewed research out there, management studies, forest monitoring associated with projects, measurements, local expertise that we use as scientific evidence. But then we also have social and economic community values. So input from folks in Durango and Pagosa and Dolores nationwide. And then we also have the judgment and expertise of folks like myself, like Noah, folks that we work with. And all that comes together to form something we call evidence-based forest management. We use this for a lot of what we do. It supports our forest planning, our forest plan, which is sort of an umbrella document for everything we do. It's firmly rooted in science. Science and evidence-based management supports the NEPA planning process. That's the National Environmental Policy Act planning process. And then it also helps us in our implementation, what we specifically do on the ground when we take these plans and put them in action. So what is the evidence supporting management of national forests? Focusing specifically on the pine forests. We're going to start really broad here, or really simple. Tree densities and forest fuels increase over time. If you don't do anything, these fuels will accumulate, and the more they accumulate, they'll lead to more intense and severe wildfires. You know, in wetter places, decomposition because of the moisture will reduce and get rid of some of this material, put it in the atmosphere. But in the dry Southwest, this material won't go away without fire or some type of removal. And then the longer they're out there, the more severe the fire can get. You see in the photo here with the big flames, you couldn't have those big flames if it weren't for those trees establishing over time. In the photo on the right, there's not much fuel to burn in that photo. So the flames are really short and not a lot of things, not a lot of heat can get released and not a lot of trees are gonna die. So that's sort of the basic foundation for management interventions. In these pine forests, these high severity fires burning in thick forests were relatively rare historically. And when I say historically, I mean pre-1880, before Europeans settled the Southwest. And we had enough lightning or human ignited fires historically every 10 to 25 years that fuels really rarely accumulated to the point where we had severe fires that burned in the tree crowns. There is some evidence that we had some rare crown fires in these forests, in these pine forests, but they're relatively rare. So that's kind of another underlying bit of evidence. There's many studies across the Southwest that show this general finding. When we get these higher severity fires in these dense forest conditions that we have today, they're possible of converting our forests to non-forest. The non-forest in this case, in many cases, is grasslands and shrublands. If you live in Durango, you don't really have to use your imagination to understand what this could look like. The Missionary Ridge Fire burned in 2002. It was 71,000 acres, huge area. And across many areas, there aren't any trees. In fact, this photo right here are folks in the San Juan National Forest going to put trees back on the landscape in a place where there probably wouldn't be trees unless we put them there. This other quote from a study in Arizona that looked at a huge fire down there, hundreds of thousands of acres. And the results of looking at that show that basically what we're going to get down there is a big landscape of oaks, junipers, and locusts, a really spiky shrub, and then a random tree here and there. So there's a lot of evidence to support that this could be what we're dealing with if we have these high severity fires. And not to get too negative here, but this conversion to non-forest states, to shrublands and grasslands, could be made worse by the climate we're expecting in the not too distant future. For one, when we have a warmer climate, something that's predicted by almost every model, we're going to have potentially more severe fires, more heat release. These hot, dry conditions could also make it difficult for trees to establish. So if it's really hot, it can be hard for trees to get started and make it past the first few years. Model predictions are really together on the fact we're going to have a warmer future. In the Southwest, we're not sure if we're going to have a wetter or drier future, but we're likely going to have one that's both wet some years and really dry other years. And that combination could be really rough. So we have a lot of reasons why we wouldn't want to rely on just high severity fires to manage our forest. So what can we do? And from my perspective, focusing on harvest to proactively manage our forest to avoid the situation. Basically, these interventions are shown that they can reduce potential fire intensity. So if we take fuels out, there's going to be less heat release when we have a fire. We can reduce severity, meaning that we're going to have less trees killed, and that can protect firefighter lives, that can protect communities, people in communities, and that can protect their property. Lots of evidence to support that. These type of interventions can increase the resiliency of our forests to disturbances, not only fire, but things like droughts and bark beetle attack. Bark beetles love to attack mature trees in high densities, and there's a lot of evidence showing by reducing density, we can avoid that type of outbreak. And this might allow us to avoid conversion of our forests to shrublands or grasslands. So here's just some considerations when we talk about interventions. Not everything we do out on the ground is going to help. If we were to take our forests, take the valuable logs out and just throw the rest on the ground, like this extreme example, which is actually from a flood, not really from a forest operation, we'd end up with a worse situation when it comes to fuels. So you have to do things like remove those fuels as chips or pile burn some of the slash in order to really take care of the hazard. Not all interventions will reduce resiliency. If we were to come into a stand like this with big trees and cut all the big trees down because we wanted to produce logs, that's not going to help either. We're going to leave a bunch of flammable small trees, and we're going to make the situation worse. So what we're doing in these types of forests is focusing on the long-term outcome, not just what we're removing. And then something to know about before we get into our optimistic take on how we can manage our forests, that there is some evidence out there that shows that everything that we could try out on the ground might not matter given the changing climate. We're already getting fires like this picture here. This is the Hayman fire on the Front Range of Colorado. And this thing was 140,000 acres or so. And across most of this landscape you're seeing, you're probably not going to see a lot of trees. This is a grassland. So hopefully by proactively managing, paying attention to our emissions, we can avoid this type of outcome, but it's not for certain. So with that said, let's focus on our restoration and fuels reduction efforts on the San Juan. I'm going to focus on these drier types that are adapted to frequent fire. And we're going to focus on projects that reduce fire intensity and severity as sort of a primary goal. I want you to realize that everything that we're talking about is going to involve some trade-off between ecological, social, and economic outcomes. If it's too expensive, we probably can't do it. If people hate it, we can't do it. If it negatively impacts the ecosystem, we're probably not going to do it. So we kind of have to balance all these different dimensions. And you'll see that we use different tools in different places, from really small footprints to really large footprints, and for a range of reasons and for a range of outputs. And I'm also going to focus a little on these efforts and showing what happens to some of that material that comes out of the forest, something that we don't always talk about in these types of presentations. So the first project I'm going to talk about is the Salls Creek fuel wood harvest that have been taking place in the Salls Creek landscape just northeast of Bayfield in southwest Colorado. On this map, for folks not from the area, this bottom line right here, this is the New Mexico border. Bayfield's just a little bit east of Durango. And this is an area right outside of Bayfield, a lot of trails, a lot of human use. This is kind of what it looks like. This isn't a landscape where there's a ton of little tiny trees. This is a landscape where there's a lot of trees that are approaching 100 years old, and canopies are really continuous. So if we had a fire get into these canopies, it would burn across, it could burn across the canopies and kill a lot of trees. So in this landscape, for the last decade or so, we've been thinning around 20 to 40 acres of trees annually. This thinning has been taking place by folks internally with the Forest Service, fuels crews, fire crews, by commercial fuel wood cutters, people in the community that cut trees in order to sell fuel wood, and also the Southwest Conservation Corps crews. Southwest Conservation Corps, SEC, is a great partner with the Forest Service. They put young folks to work doing forest restoration work, trail work, and also veteran crews. So these guys will go out there, cut down the trees, leave the tree boles or the trunks, and then pile the slash. We pile the slash and burn it later on. And then the fuel wood is either removed by the public or by commercial fuel wood cutters, usually like late summer, early fall. This is an example of a really small scale intervention, but it's moving us in the right direction. So scaling up a little bit, I'm going to talk about the Coyote Creek timber sale. This is an area just southeast of Pagosa Springs, just slightly north of the New Mexico border. So down Highway 84 if you're from the area. Coyote Creek looks a lot like Salls Creek. So this is an area that was managed, was logged in the last century. There's not very many big old trees in this landscape, but what's left is a landscape of pretty much even-aged trees, 80 to 100 years old, with a fairly continuous canopy. We don't have a lot of young trees, so if something happens to the big trees, there's nothing really to move in other than potentially shrubs. So a goal here is to promote conditions that will allow young pines to establish. And that usually means putting some light on the ground that these trees need to get established. So what we did here, and this is around a 300-acre landscape. Apologies for the map. My wife would hate this. She's a GIS specialist. But it's a 300-acre landscape. Within this landscape, we're doing work across the broader area that leaves a more open forest condition, lower tree densities, like you see in the bottom photo, over most of the area. And then within that landscape, we're putting in openings where we remove trees in patches up to several acres. So we kind of are going to end up with a matrix of both trees and openings, something that the evidence shows we had historically. And so what's happening with the outputs? Well, a contractor from northern New Mexico, Bill Moore, his company W.H. Moore Cash Lumber in Espanola, New Mexico, is doing the work out here. He has a small business. He produces rough cut beams. He produces boards. And then his sort of main product is vigas, which is a roundwood product you see here. And that's something that you'll see used in adobe style homes in New Mexico, Southwest Colorado. And it's something that is sort of a special local product that we have available. We pile the slash for burning from this, so none of that gets removed. So that's another aspect of this type of operation. So moving up in scale, I'll talk a little bit about the Pagosa Area Long-Term Stewardship Contract. If you're from the area, you may have heard about this contract. It's a multi-year, 10-year contract in these types of forests. Mainly the Ponderosa Pine and mixed conifer forest types. This contract is going to impact around 4,500 acres, so quite a bit more than the last project I talked about. This contract involves thinning of trees and the removal of logs, but then also the slash, so the tops, limbs, branches, and needles. And I'll show you what happens with that in just a sec. It was awarded to the Pagosa Forest Health Company in Pagosa Springs, and it's currently in its 8th year. So this contract is well in swing. So here's a little example of how this operation works. This is what we'd call mechanized operation. So the trees are cut with a machine, like you see here. The other projects I showed you were work done by hand. And so you can imagine that the pace can get picked up considerably when you have a mechanized operation like this. This blue machinery on the other side, this is actually a chipper that takes the tops, limbs, all the stuff that would be burned as slash, and it chips it into this chips you can see here behind here. That's a product to come out of here I'll talk about here in just a second. So this is kind of what this operation looks like. We can take a dense forest condition where we have a lot of smaller trees coming in under the taller trees and open it up quite a bit. This is an area just west of Pagosa Springs. Here's another area just north of Pagosa Springs in the 4 Mile Creek area, showing what one of these operations creates. Oh, excuse me. As far as outputs go, this operation produces rough cut, rough sawn boards, just like the other one in greater capacity. It also produces posts that are shipped to Denver and pressure treated. And so folks can use those materials in landscaping, allows it to withstand decay a lot more. The biomass, or the chips that we were talking about, right now that material is being sent down to Albuquerque, and it's being used by a company to produce soil, potting soil, and compost. That's not a very value-added use, but it's a way to deal with some of the costs. The end goal for this contractor is to produce biochar, which is a high-quality charcoal type product that is very absorbent. It's used for all kinds of horticultural uses, used on golf course quite a bit to conserve water. Range of uses, it's actually worth quite a bit of money. I think a bag of that stuff, potting soil type bag, is like $30. This contractor also wants to produce compressed wood briquettes that could be used in place of firewood. So scaling up to the next project, talk just quickly about the Lone Pine Vegetation Management Project. This is a project that just got through the planning phase this past winter. And this project is located north of Dolores on the western side of the forest. And this project was driven partially in response to some of the same increases in tree density we've been talking about, but then also a more recent bark beetle outbreak that's been killing patches of trees, like you see in this photo right here. None of this work has been completed yet. And as you see, this is going to be affecting a much larger area, definitely affecting vegetation on the scale that fire is affecting our landscapes. And this project is going to affect over 40,000 acres of forest The goals of this are much like some of the other ones we've talked about. We want to increase the forest resiliency to disturbances, promote diversity in ages, both young and mature trees. We may be doing some planting with this to promote recovery of forest vegetation in areas where the bark beetles killed a lot of trees. We'll be reducing wildfire risks. And then we're also going to be producing forest products, putting some tree logs on trucks. And I'll talk a little bit about the scale of that operation. This, like I said, almost 40,000 acres of forest and plantation, young forest thinning over almost a decade. And as part of this, we'll be cutting both dead trees and then thinning areas of green trees. We'll be planting some trees, and then all of these activities will prepare some parts of this landscape for prescribed fire that's useful in helping to establish young pines and then reducing some of the forest fuels on the ground after these types of treatments. Just a little bit of background on the bark beetles. This landscape's been affected by a number of beetles that affect ponderosa pines. This originally started off in small patches. These patches have grown in size, and now we're dealing with bark beetle impacts at the scale of thousands of acres. So some of the thinning we're going to be doing is to try to keep that from spreading into areas that don't have that type of impact right now by reducing density. And then we'll also be cutting some of these dead trees, which produce an interesting product we'll talk about in a sec. We'll be thinning some of these dense plantations. So in these young trees, they're fighting for resources like water and light. And so by taking some of them out, the remaining ones can survive and grow a little bit faster. In areas where we have some mature trees left, we'll be thinning around some of these small trees from around these mature trees, some of which are fairly old, to try to maintain that diversity in the stand, allow them to withstand drought a little bit better. And then probably the main impact from this project will be to thin these dense mature forests that, like most of the forests, are trees around 80 to 100 years old. And end up with a condition kind of like this, where we have an open understory, a condition where it'd be hard for a fire to move from the ground and burn across tree canopies. So outputs from this effort, one of them is going to be blue stain paneling. This is a product that's sawn only from dead ponderosa pine trees. So bark beetles get into the pine tree, they introduce a fungus that wouldn't be on the interior of the tree, and then that fungus causes these the interior of the tree to turn blue. And so what you see here is ponderosa pine wood, only it's been stained by this fungus brought in by a beetle. It's a cool product. It's paneling. It's produced by a company in Dolores called Aspen Wallwood. And this is actually wood I put on my ceiling. So this is actually my house that we built a few years back. So I definitely endorse it. Another product that'll come out of this project is pine boards. So these are boards that don't have the blue stain. This is the kind of stuff you'd see at Home Depot in the board section. These are 1x4s, 1x6s, 1x8s. This will be produced in Montrose, Colorado, by company Montrose Forest Products. And then last, a new business to come online in Southwest Colorado is the Ironwood Group. These guys are taking ponderosa pine trees, they're peeling them into these sheets right here in the middle of this photo, which are then shipped to the Pacific Northwest, where they're pressed into plywood. So wood from Colorado is making its way into plywood, and then the remaining core from that peeling process creates a post product that you can actually pick up here locally at Studs Lumber in Durango. So kind of a cool process. You know, order of tens of millions of dollars has been spent on this operation over the last couple years getting this operation off the ground. So this is a nice new player we have in our forest management scene. So with that, I'll wrap up. You know, my goal here tonight was to show you that using this evidence-based forest management, that we can have both healthy and resilient forests supported by evidence, and then also have appropriate and sustainable forest industry. The work we're doing now is not the same type of work that was done 50 or 100 years ago. Science is informing our practice more than it ever has in history. And I think we're well positioned to be a national example of how we can make this work, show how human and natural ecosystems can coexist and support each other. So with that, I'll wrap it up. Thanks for tuning in, and I appreciate you guys staying with us this evening. Yeah, and with that, I can take questions. Yeah, so we got a question from Ben. His question was, excuse me one second, let me fix this screen share. Ben's question is, are old growth stands regularly targeted for harvest, or are they naturally fire resistant? That's a great question. As a general practice, old growth stands are not regularly targeted for harvest for many reasons. One of the reasons we don't really have a lot of them in areas that are really accessible because of the last century of impacts on these stands. We do have some areas of forest where we have old trees, wouldn't necessarily be considered old growth. So old growth is really a term that applies to a whole stand of trees rather than just one tree. But we do have areas where we have old trees that we're managing in order to reduce fire hazard, to promote resilience of stand conditions. And so in those areas, we may be harvesting, but with very few exceptions, we're retaining some of the oldest trees in those stands. And the efforts that we apply in those stands would be aimed at increasing resiliency of those stands and keeping those old trees alive. So great question. So from Andy, to be most successful on forestersonly.com, which trees should I list as my favorites? I'll tell you, redwoods, sequoias, and of course ponderosa pines are definitely big hits. Or they would be if that was actually a thing. And thanks to Emily for actually reading that. April Fools.
Okay, so we're going to open it up for questions for another 30 seconds or so, and then we're going to thank everybody for joining us. So there's a little bit of a lag, so please go ahead and submit your questions, and then we'll give it a little more time and close up.
So Mike asks, there are a lot of complexities on the landscape. How do you decide where to do treatments? Another good question. There's a couple ways we can talk about this. So some of the decision making that goes into doing the treatments of today is based on the work that was done over the last 5 to 10 years. So we have to go through a planning process, sort of not unlike the flow chart that Noah presented. And so a lot of what we're doing are projects that my predecessors decided to do 5, 10 years ago. That said, some of the main areas we focus on, particularly with regard to these Ponderosa pine forests at these mid elevations, tend to be focused in the wildland urban interface. So these are the areas adjacent to communities where reducing fuels can have a sort of a maximum benefit on community safety, and especially when we have fires moving into those landscapes. We also are moving more and more towards larger landscapes because we have some industry partners that can work at that scale. That allows us to really treat lots of acres. And so we tend to focus on areas with contiguous accessible acres at that scale. So areas where we have an existing road system and some operable ground, at least as when we're talking about harvest and mechanical treatments. So good questions. Another question, do you see the industries you mentioned for your projects being impacted by the COVID outbreak? That's a great question. I think everybody's affected right now, and I'll say there's no way industry isn't being affected currently. The biggest question we have amongst my colleagues is what's going to happen when this outbreak abates and we're dealing with the fallout from the economic situation we've all been dealing with. I mean, it really is unprecedented in my life, and I really don't have anything comparable to compare it to. We're hoping that demand picks back up for forest products, and the purchasers and contractors we work with will all be still wanting to harvest trees. But a lot of that will depend on how the economy and the housing market are affected, because that's where wood is mainly used. So I think that's going to wrap it up. Again, thanks for tuning in, and I think I'll hand it back to Emily.
All right, awesome. Thank you so much, Matt, for all of that, and super cool information. Thank you for sharing all of your work and fielding those great questions asked by Ben and Andy and Mike. We really do appreciate it. I do apologize for the choppy transition between Noah and Mike's presentations earlier, but it looks like we were able to keep rocking the conversation. So thanks for hanging in there with us. And yeah, all right, folks, I think that this is about all we have for tonight. But before you leave, don't forget to join us next week, same place, same time, for the second installment of the Forest and Fire Learning Series, when we're going to delve into what we've learned about resilience since the 416 fire and existing city actions that contribute to community resilience. Also, don't forget to enter for a chance to win the Mountainsmith Tour Pack donated by Garden Swartz Outdoors. You must, one, be 18 years of age or older. You have to like and or follow Mountain Studies Institute on our Facebook page, and you have to take only 2 minutes to fill out the survey that's pinned to our comment section. I want to give a very big thank you to our speakers, Dr. Michael Remke, Noah Daniels, and Matt Tuten, for sharing all of your expertise with our community and beyond. We really appreciate all of you and all of the work that you do for our community. So thank you so much. And I also want to give a very big thank you to my colleague, Dana Hayward, who works with MSI as the Forest Team's Partnership Coordinator, for fielding Facebook questions and for really helping this online event move along more seamlessly. So thank you. Again, I want to give a huge thank you to our sponsors for their help in making this event possible. So thank you to Wildfire Adapted Partnership, to San Juan Citizens Alliance, to the Southern Rocky Mountain Fire Science Network, Colorado State Forest, to Durango Outdoor Exchange, to Maria's Bookstore, Garden Swartz Outdoors, and to Four Corners River Sports, to Ska Brewing, The Powerhouse Science Center, again, where we would have hosted tonight's event if we could have, to the San Juan Headwaters Forest Health Partnership, the 232 Cohesive Strategy Partnership, and to the Dolores Watershed Resilient Forest Collaborative. Thank you so much. I was told I was supposed to introduce myself, so I'll go ahead and let you know that my name is Emily Swindell. I work with Mountain Studies Institute as a Forest Program Associate, and just wanted to say thank you again very much for joining us, and we wish you a wonderful evening. Stay safe, stay happy, stay healthy, and staying out there, and we look forward to seeing you next week. Take care.